When we talk about narcissism, most people picture arrogance, vanity, or someone who loves taking selfies. But in clinical psychology, narcissism goes much deeper than surface-level self-importance. It is a personality structure, an entire way of relating to the world, built on three pillars: grandiosity, a constant hunger for admiration, and a striking lack of empathy. These traits don't just show up occasionally, they dominate how the person thinks, feels, and interacts with others. Now let's ground this in something concrete. In psychiatry, narcissism becomes a diagnosable disorder when it meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, as described in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. According to this manual, a diagnosis requires that a person consistently shows at least 5 out of 9 symptoms. These include fantasies of unlimited success or power, a belief they are special and unique, an excessive need for admiration, entitlement, exploiting others, a lack of empathy, envy of others, and arrogant behaviors or attitudes. The key point here is that everyday narcissistic traits don't automatically equal a disorder. Many of us may recognize bits of these tendencies in ourselves, but NPD represents a rigid, entrenched pattern that interferes with a person's relationships, work, and overall life. At the heart of this disorder is a paradox. On the outside, the narcissist seems inflated, full of confidence, superiority, and pride, but beneath that facade lies an extremely fragile self-esteem, one that is unstable and easily injured. Think of it like a balloon, big, shiny, and floating high, but one small prick and it collapses instantly. Narcissists do not actually possess deep self-love. Their sense of worth is critically dependent on others, reflecting back admiration and validation. Without that external fuel, they can feel empty, worthless, or enraged. A crucial part of this pathology is what we call the empathy deficit. Empathy, at its core, comes in two forms. Cognitive empathy is the intellectual ability to understand what someone else is feeling, basically, perspective-taking. Affective empathy, on the other hand, is the ability to emotionally resonate with what someone else feels. Most narcissists have cognitive empathy. They can often read people very well, picking up on insecurities, hopes, and vulnerabilities. But they lack effective empathy. They don't truly feel compassion or concern for others. Instead, they often use their ability to read emotions as a tool for manipulation and control. This is why interacting with a narcissist can feel so confusing. They seem to get you on one level, but completely disregard your feelings on another. To really understand narcissism, we need to look at some of the major thinkers who studied this personality structure. Otto Kernberg, a psychoanalyst, described pathological narcissism as part of what he called borderline personality organization, where the person relies heavily on primitive defenses like splitting the world into all good and all bad. Heinz Kohut, another pioneer, emphasized the developmental roots of narcissism, describing it as a failure in the child's formation of a cohesive sense of self. According to Kohut, when a child's natural need for admiration and mirroring isn't met, or is met inconsistently, they may develop a fragile self that requires constant external support to stay intact. Modern neuroscience also supports these clinical observations. Brain imaging studies have shown that individuals with high narcissistic traits often have reduced gray matter volume in the anterior insula, a region linked to empathy and emotional awareness. Other studies, such as those published in Personality and Individual Differences, demonstrate how narcissists score lower on measures of effective empathy, but often average on cognitive empathy. This reinforces the idea that they understand feelings without genuinely sharing them. So to sum up this first foundation, narcissism in its pathological form is not mere vanity. It's an entire personality structure rooted in unstable self-esteem, dependent on constant validation, and characterized by a lack of emotional empathy. This is what makes it not just difficult, but profoundly damaging for those who come close to a narcissist. Now that we've nailed down the core pathology, let's broaden the lens. Narcissism is not one single thing. It exists on a spectrum, from healthy self-confidence on one end, all the way to the rigid, destructive disorder we call NPD on the other. In fact, having some narcissistic traits is not only normal, it can even be adaptive. For example, a healthy dose of self-regard can help us pursue goals, assert boundaries, and take pride in our achievements. But when these traits dominate a person's identity and relationships, they cross into pathology. Psychologists often describe narcissism as existing in different flavors, and understanding these distinctions is crucial. The most familiar type is grandiose narcissism, sometimes called overt narcissism. This is the classic image people have in mind, the person who is arrogant, self-important, boastful, and constantly craving the spotlight. They thrive on attention, exaggerate their accomplishments, and demand admiration. Their presence can be magnetic, even charismatic, but over time it becomes exhausting and oppressive. But there is another form, often overlooked, called vulnerable narcissism or covert narcissism. This type is not loud and boastful. It's hypersensitive, insecure, and defensive. Vulnerable narcissists may appear shy or withdrawn, but underneath they still carry an inflated sense of entitlement. They are prone to envy, bitterness, and self-pity. Instead of bragging openly, they may express their narcissism through passive aggression, playing the victim, or resenting others for not recognizing their specialness. Research by Aaron Pincus and colleagues has been instrumental in mapping out this two-factor model of grandiose versus vulnerable narcissism, showing that both are rooted in the same fragile self-structure, but manifest in opposite styles. There is also a less discussed subtype called the communal narcissist. These individuals derive their sense of superiority not from wealth, status, or talent, but from morality and helpfulness. They position themselves as the most giving, the most charitable, the most virtuous. On the surface, this looks admirable, but the motivation is the same: to receive admiration, praise, and recognition. For instance, a communal narcissist might volunteer constantly, but become furious if they don't get credit or public acknowledgement. This subtype was studied in depth by psychologists Jebor, Sedikides, and colleagues, who found that communal narcissists tend to score high in self-enhancement motives, despite presenting as altruistic. It's also important to distinguish between trait narcissism and full-blown NPD. Someone may have high levels of narcissistic traits and still function relatively well in life. They may be ambitious, competitive, or self-focused, but not necessarily destructive. In fact, research in organizational psychology suggests that moderate levels of narcissistic traits can even be advantageous in leadership, as they fuel confidence and risk-taking. But when these traits harden into a fixed personality disorder, they cause significant impairment, damaging relationships, careers, and even the narcissist's own well-being. This is why seeing narcissism as a spectrum is so useful. On one end, we have healthy self-esteem, the ability to value ourselves while also valuing others. Moving further along, we encounter elevated narcissistic traits, difficult but not necessarily toxic. At the far extreme, we encounter narcissistic personality disorder, a rigid, destructive pattern where relationships become transactional, empathy is absent, and the individual's entire sense of self revolves around extracting admiration. Understanding this spectrum also helps us avoid overusing the term narcissist. Not everyone who brags, seeks attention, or has moments of selfishness is suffering from NPD. But at the same time, recognizing where someone falls on this spectrum can be a powerful tool for predicting how they will behave in close relationships, workplaces, or communities. To really understand narcissism, we need to step behind the mask. Because everything we see on the surface, the charm, the arrogance, the manipulation, is only the performance. The real story is happening underneath, in the psychological architecture of the narcissist's inner world. One of the most widely accepted ideas in psychodynamic psychology is that narcissism develops out of faulty early childhood experiences. A child's sense of self or identity doesn't form in isolation. It develops in response to the way caregivers mirror, validate, and respond to the child's emotions. When that process goes well, the child grows up with an inner core of stability and a realistic sense of self-worth. But when that process breaks down, two things often happen. Either the child is overvalued only for their achievements, or they are neglected and unseen for who they truly are. In both cases, the message the child absorbs is, you are not loved for simply existing, you are only loved if you perform, achieve, or meet someone else's needs. This lays the groundwork for what psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut described as a fragmented self. Instead of developing a cohesive identity, the child learns to build a false self, a constructed persona designed to be impressive, flawless, and invulnerable. This false self is what the narcissist presents to the world. It's polished, confident, and often magnetic, but hidden behind it is the true self, a part of the person that feels defective, unworthy, and deeply ashamed. The tragedy is that the true self rarely gets expressed because it feels too vulnerable, too unsafe. The false self becomes the mask that never comes off. To protect this fragile structure, narcissists rely heavily on a psychological defense called splitting. Splitting means dividing people, and sometimes themselves, into all good or all bad. If someone praises them, that person is seen as entirely wonderful. If someone criticizes them, even mildly, that person can instantly flip into the category of enemy or betrayer. The same split often applies internally. They must maintain an image of themselves as superior, flawless, and special, while projecting all their flaws and weaknesses outward onto others. This mechanism is central to what Otto Kernberg called pathological narcissism, where the psyche is organized around defending against feelings of shame and inferiority. Another key concept here is narcissistic supply. This term refers to the constant flow of admiration, attention, and validation that the narcissist depends on to regulate their fragile sense of self. Think of it as fuel. Without supply, the false self begins to crack, and the hidden feelings of worthlessness start to leak through. This is why narcissists chase admiration so relentlessly. It isn't just vanity, it's survival. If the flow of supply stops, they experience what is often called a narcissistic injury, a deep wound to the ego that can trigger rage, withdrawal, or depression. From the perspective of object relations theory, another branch of psychoanalysis, the narcissist never truly relates to people as whole, separate individuals. Instead, they experience others as objects, either sources of supply or threats to their ego. A partner, for instance, is not fully recognized as a separate person with needs and feelings. Instead, the partner is seen as a reflection of the narcissist's own worth. If the partner admires them, they're valuable. If the partner criticizes them, they become worthless or dangerous in the narcissist's eyes. This objectifying way of relating explains why relationships with narcissists often feel so dehumanizing. Modern research supports these psychodynamic theories. Studies in developmental psychology show strong links between inconsistent parental validation and later narcissistic traits. Neuroscientific research even suggests that the brains of highly narcissistic individuals process self-relevant information differently, showing heightened activity in areas tied to self-referential thought, but lower activity in regions tied to emotional resonance with others. In other words, their brains are wired to amplify the self while mooting genuine emotional connection. So when we look beneath the surface, narcissism is not simply arrogance. It's a defense system. It's a false self constructed to guard against a fragile, shame-ridden core. And every strategy they use, from seeking supply to devaluing others, serves one function: to keep that inner vulnerability hidden from both others and themselves. Now that we've explored the narcissist's inner world, let's look outward, at the way they operate in relationships. Narcissists don't just exist in isolation. Their pathology comes alive in how they interact with others, and over time, they develop a toolkit of strategies to control, dominate, and extract what they need. These aren't random behaviors, they're calculated techniques, refined over years of trial and error. One of the most powerful tools is love bombing. This is the intense, intoxicating phase at the start of many relationships with a narcissist. They overwhelm their target with affection, attention, and promises. It can look like constant compliments, grand romantic gestures, or nonstop texting. To the unsuspecting person, it feels like they've finally met their soulmate. But love bombing isn't love, it's bait. By flooding you with admiration, the narcissist creates a powerful emotional bond that makes it very hard to pull away later. In fact, research on coercive control shows that this intense early idealization sets up what psychologists call trauma bonding, a cycle of reward and punishment that keeps the victim hooked. Then comes gaslighting, one of the most insidious tactics in their arsenal. Gaslighting is the deliberate attempt to make someone doubt their memory, perception, or sanity. A narcissist might deny things they clearly said, dismiss your feelings with phrases like "you're too sensitive," or even rewrite events entirely. That never happened, you're imagining it. Over time, this corrodes the victim's trust in themselves. Studies in psychiatry research highlight how prolonged gaslighting can cause cognitive disorientation and self-doubt that mimic symptoms of anxiety disorders. It's not just lying, it's psychological warfare designed to destabilize the victim's reality. Another recurring pattern is the cycle of idealization and devaluation. After the love bombing phase, cracks begin to show. Suddenly, the partner who is perfect becomes flawed in the narcissist's eyes. Criticism, contempt, and emotional withdrawal replace the earlier adoration. Then, just when the victim is about to give up, the narcissist may swing back with charm and affection. This cycle keeps the victim constantly off balance, chasing the return of the good version of the narcissist. The unpredictability is what makes it so addictive. Just like a slot machine, the payoff comes randomly, and that makes people cling even harder. Narcissists also use triangulation to maintain control. This involves bringing a third person into the dynamic, an ex, a coworker, even a family member, to create jealousy or competition. They might say, "My ex never complained about this," or subtly compare you to a friend. The goal is to destabilize you, to make you feel insecure, and to remind you that their attention is conditional. Triangulation isn't about the third person, it's about keeping you on edge, working harder to secure the narcissist's approval. And when direct confrontation doesn't suit their purpose, narcissists often resort to passive aggression and the silent treatment. Instead of openly expressing anger, they withhold affection, stonewall, or communicate through subtle jabs. The The silent treatment in particular is powerful. It creates anxiety and desperation in the victim, who may go to great lengths to make things right. Research on emotional abuse highlights that this withdrawal of communication can be as damaging as outright verbal aggression, because it triggers the same fear and rejection circuits in the brain. Taken together, these tactics form the narcissist's interpersonal playbook. They charm, confuse, destabilize, and punish, all with the aim of keeping control and ensuring a steady flow of narcissistic supply. And the most alarming part, many victims don't even realize they're being manipulated until they're deeply entangled. When you're in a relationship with a narcissist, whether romantic, familial, or professional, the damage is not always obvious at first. On the surface, you might think you're just dealing with someone difficult, moody, or high maintenance. But over time, the psychological toll can be profound. Narcissistic abuse reshapes how a person sees themselves, how they interpret reality, and even how their brain functions under stress. One of the first impacts victims experience is cognitive dissonance. This is the mental conflict that arises when you hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time. On one hand, the victim remembers the love-bombing phase. This person loves me, they're amazing, they made me feel so special. On the other hand, they're now enduring criticism, gaslighting, or neglect. The brain struggles to resolve this contradiction, and more often than not, the victim ends up blaming themselves. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I need to do better. This self-blame protects the illusion of the good narcissist, but corrodes the victim's confidence. Over time, the victim's self-esteem and identity erode. Constant criticism, devaluation, and manipulation chip away at their sense of worth. A once confident, independent person may find themselves second-guessing every decision, apologizing for things they didn't do, and losing touch with their own preferences and desires. In clinical terms, this is sometimes called identity disturbance, a loss of the stable sense of who you are. Victims often describe feeling like they've become a shell of themselves. For many, the damage escalates into symptoms of CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Unlike PTSD, which usually results from a single traumatic event, CPTSD develops from prolonged exposure to ongoing trauma, such as the cycles of abuse with a narcissist. Symptoms can include hypervigilance, constantly being on edge, waiting for the next outburst, emotional dysregulation, intrusive thoughts, and deep feelings of shame. Research in trauma psychology, especially the work of Judith Herman, emphasizes that relational trauma, abuse in the context of a close relationship, can be more damaging than trauma from a one-time event because it corrodes trust at the deepest level. Another devastating effect is what's called the trauma bond. This is the paradoxical attachment that forms between victim and abuser, reinforced by the cycle of intermittent reinforcement. Remember, sometimes the narcissist is cruel, other times they show affection or tenderness. That unpredictability makes the brain's reward system fire even more strongly. Patrick Carnes, who pioneered research on trauma bonds, compared it to an addiction. The victim becomes hooked not on the abuse itself, but on the hope that the good version of the narcissist will return. This is why people in these relationships often say, "I don't even recognize myself anymore. I know they're hurting me, but I can't seem to leave." And then there's isolation, one of the most strategic moves in the narcissist's playbook. Slowly but surely, the victim's support system gets dismantled. Friends are dismissed as bad influences. Family members are portrayed as unsupportive. The victim starts to feel that no one else understands them except the narcissist. In this way, the narcissist becomes the victim's entire world, the sole source of validation, companionship, and identity. Without outside perspectives, the manipulation becomes even harder to recognize. When you put these effects together, cognitive dissonance, shattered self-esteem, CPTSD symptoms, trauma bonding, and isolation, the impact of narcissistic abuse becomes clear. It is not just about hurt feelings or a toxic argument here and there. It is a systematic dismantling of the victim's psychological foundation, and the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to break free. At this point, you might wonder, if the abuse is so damaging, why don't people just leave? From the outside, it can look simple: pack up, walk away, move on. But from the inside, leaving a narcissist can feel almost impossible, and the reasons aren't just emotional, they're deeply psychological, even neurological. One of the biggest reasons is something called intermittent reinforcement. This is a principle from behavioral psychology that explains why slot machines are so addictive. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain's dopamine system goes into overdrive. Sometimes you get nothing, sometimes you get a jackpot, and that uncertainty keeps you hooked. Narcissistic relationships work the same way. The victim never knows when they'll get affection, praise, or validation, and when they'll face criticism or withdrawal. The rare moments of kindness feel like jackpots, keeping the victim chasing the high of the good narcissist. Another reason is the hope for the real person. Victims often cling to the memory of the love-bombing phase, the version of the narcissist who was attentive, affectionate, and seemed to understand them perfectly. They tell themselves, if I just try harder, if I'm more patient, if I don't upset them, that version will come back. But here's the painful truth. That version was never real. It was a mask designed to hook the victim in. Yet emotionally, the hope of its return can be so powerful that it keeps people trapped for years. The narcissist also manipulates through guilt and obligation. Victims are made to feel responsible for the narcissist's happiness, moods, and even survival. They might hear lines like, "You're the only one who understands me," or "Without you, I have nothing." Over time, this creates a deep sense of duty. Leaving doesn't feel like walking away from abuse. It feels like abandoning someone who desperately needs you. Studies on coercive control emphasize that this sense of obligation is one of the strongest anchors in abusive relationships. Then there's fear of retaliation. Many victims know that leaving will not be peaceful. The narcissist may launch a smear campaign, spreading lies to friends, family, or colleagues. Some escalate into stalking, financial sabotage, or threats. This fear is not irrational. It's based on the narcissist's past behavior. For many victims, staying seems safer than facing the storm that comes with trying to leave. And finally, we have what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy. This is the belief that because you've already invested so much time, energy, and love, you can't walk away now. Victims think, I've already spent years in this relationship. If I leave, all that effort is wasted. The irony is that staying only sinks more cost into a losing investment, but emotionally, it feels like leaving would make everything meaningless. When you add all of this together, the addictive pull of intermittent reinforcement, the longing for the love-bombing phase, the guilt and obligation, the very real fear of retaliation, and the sunk cost fallacy, you start to see why leaving a narcissist is one of the hardest challenges a victim will ever face. It's not weakness. It's not foolishness. It's the result of a carefully engineered psychological trap. So far, we've been looking at narcissism mostly in the context of romantic relationships. But narcissism doesn't stay confined to dating or marriage. It shows up in families, friendships, workplaces, and even broader culture. Understanding these contexts is crucial because it helps you recognize that the same psychological dynamics repeat, just with different masks. Let's start with the narcissistic parent. For a child, having a parent like this can be devastating because a parent is supposed to be a safe, nurturing figure. But the narcissistic parent often sees the child as an extension of themselves rather than as an independent individual. That means love becomes conditional. If the child makes the parent proud through achievements, appearances, or obedience, they are praised and loved. If not, they are criticized, shamed, or ignored. This leads many children of narcissists to grow up either as people pleasers, always striving for approval, or as adults who feel empty and lost because they never developed a stable sense of identity. Research on parentification shows that children of narcissistic parents are often forced into roles, caretaker, rescuer, or trophy child, that meet the parent's needs while neglecting the child's own development. Now consider the narcissistic friend. At first, they might seem exciting, charismatic, or fun to be around, but over time, the friendship becomes one-sided. Conversations revolve around them. Their successes matter, but yours are dismissed or downplayed. If you come to them with problems, they may minimize your feelings or even turn the spotlight back to themselves. You think you're stressed? Let me tell you what I've been dealing with. In many cases, narcissistic friends are also highly competitive, unable to celebrate your wins without inserting their own. This dynamic leaves you drained rather than nourished by the friendship. Then there's the narcissistic boss or colleague, which is a context many people are familiar with. In the workplace, narcissists can rise quickly because their confidence and ambition often look like leadership. But over time, the cracks show. They take credit for other people's work, shift blame when things go wrong, and create a toxic, competitive environment where loyalty to them matters more than actual performance. Studies in organizational psychology, including work by Tomas Chamorro, show that narcissistic leaders often cause high turnover rates and long-term damage to company culture, even if they shine in the short term. For employees under them, the constant criticism, shifting expectations, and lack of acknowledgement can feel eerily similar to the cycles of abuse in a personal relationship. Cultural and gender factors also shape how narcissism plays out. In societies that heavily reward individualism, competition, and external success, narcissistic traits can sometimes be normalized, even celebrated. Think of environments where being the best or being endlessly self-promotional is encouraged. On the flip side, vulnerable narcissism, the hypersensitive victim-playing type, may be more socially acceptable in cultures or contexts where overt arrogance is frowned upon. Gender roles also matter. Research suggests that men are more likely to express overt, grandiose narcissism, while women may more often show covert narcissism, presenting as self-sacrificing or victimized while still harboring entitlement and resentment. These aren't hard rules, but they show how socialization shapes the mask narcissism wears. The key point here is that narcissism isn't just something you encounter in an intimate partner. It can be a parent who shaped your self-worth, a friend who drains you, a boss who exploits you, or even a culture that rewards the very behaviors that harm relationships. Once you learn to spot the patterns, you'll notice them in many corners of life. At this stage, it's important to pause and draw some clear boundaries. Narcissism is a complex personality structure, and it often gets confused with other disorders, or even with traits that aren't disordered at all. Mislabeling someone as a narcissist when they don't meet the criteria can cause harm, so let's carefully separate narcissism from other conditions. First, let's compare narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. On the surface, these two can look similar. Both involve unstable relationships, intense emotions, and a deep fear of abandonment, but the core drivers are different. In borderline personality disorder, the root problem is a fragile sense of self and a chronic emptiness. The borderline individual craves closeness, but fears rejection so intensely that relationships swing between clinging and pushing away. In narcissistic personality disorder, the core is grandiosity and a hunger for admiration. The narcissist isn't primarily terrified of being abandoned, they're terrified of being seen as ordinary or flawed. Research by Gunderson and colleagues has shown that while overlap exists, the emotional tone differs. Borderlines tend to feel shame and anxiety, while narcissists lean toward entitlement and rage. Now compare narcissism with antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, often referred to as sociopathy. Here we also see manipulation, exploitation, and lack of empathy, but the motives are different. The narcissist manipulates to gain admiration and supply, the psychological fuel that props up their fragile self. The antisocial individual manipulates to gain power, control, or material rewards, often with complete disregard for rules, laws, or consequences. In fact, research suggests that while all people with ASPD lack empathy, not all are narcissistic. Narcissists want to be admired. Antisocial personalities don't care if you hate them, as long as they win. It's also vital to distinguish narcissism from healthy self-esteem. True self-esteem is stable and internal. A person with healthy self-regard can acknowledge mistakes, learn from criticism, and celebrate others' successes without feeling threatened. Narcissistic self-esteem, by contrast, is fragile and externally dependent. They need constant validation to feel secure. So when you meet someone who is confident, ambitious, or proud of their work, that doesn't make them a narcissist. Confidence says, I know my worth. Narcissism says, I need you to confirm my worth every moment of the day. Finally, we should separate narcissistic traits from narcissistic abuse. A person may have narcissistic tendencies, such as being self-centered or boastful, without being manipulative or abusive. Conversely, someone can engage in abusive behaviors without meeting criteria for NPD. What makes narcissistic abuse distinct is the pattern, the calculated use of love bombing, gaslighting, devaluation, and control. It's not a one-off argument or a bad day.